So today's Chaf Av. It's the yahrtzeit of the Rebbe's father. The Rebbe had a custom that on yahrtzeit, and he would commemorate really 3 yahrtzeit, his father and then later on his mother, and of course the previous Rebbe. There was always a farbrengen, and the farbrengens always involved a hadrin, a siyum mesechta. Because on a yahrtzeit you're supposed to finish a mesechta. In fact, the Rebbe would often refer to the Chaf of farbrengens by saying, "Heint is a nigle nacht." This is a night for nigle, for lomdes, not so much for chasidus. The Rebbe didn't say a maimer on Chaf Av or on Vav Tishrei regularly. On occasions he did, but the central point of that farbrengen was the Messiah Mesechta that he made for the schus of his mother and his father. Yud Shvat, the previous Rebbe's yahrtzeit, he joined both together because it was a yahrtzeit and it was also a name from Rebbe Rebbe. So there was the Maimer, Basi Lagan, and then there was also the Hadrin on the Mesechta. But every year the Rebbe made a siyum Mesechta for his father and for his mother and for his Rebbe, for the Friedrich Rebbe, with the big shturim. And he celebrated their lives and so forth. When the Rebbe first became a Rebbe, he had a problem. In hindsight, it's I guess not such a big problem, but in the Chabad tradition, Shabbos was not a day to discuss Lomdus, to discuss Nigle. Shabbos, you spoke Chassidus. The Rebbe Marash, the 4th Lubavitcher Rebbe, said, his name was Reb Shmuel, that a whole week you learn 2/3 of your time Nigle, 1/3 of your time Chassidus. And Shabbos is the other way around. 2/3 of your time you learn Chassidus, and 1/3 of your time you learn Nigle. But you don't make a shir on Lomdus on Shabbos. That's not the way Chassidim behave. A whole week you learn Nigle, Shabbos you learn Chassidus. And here the Rebbe is making a farbrengen, and he's making a hadron, a pilpul for his father. So the first hadronim, you'll take a look when Chaf Av was Shabbos, you'll see that the hadron was very chassidish. The Rebbe made a hadron on Masechta Rosh Hashanah, if I'm not mistaken. It was all based on a maimer of Michal Mecha about Birchas Kayanim. He found ways of explaining the Nigle with chassidus. But in later years, the Rebbe had no problem with learning Nigle Shabbos. Abiga let it. As long as you learn Torah, doesn't matter what. But there's one episode that I want to share with you from a Sikha from the Rebbe from the very early years, where the Rebbe mentioned, he clearly said it in conjunction with his father, although he didn't spell it out clearly, the idea of Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. That it says in the Sefer called Magid Meshorim, a Sefer from the Beis Yosef, which is a book that describes a meeting that he had with a Magid, with a Malach or a Neshama that came from the other world and taught him Torah, and he recorded it in Aramaic according to dates of the week and Parshias, the different teachings that he was taught over the period of time that he was seeing this Magid. And one of the things that's brought there is that the Magid had told him that he would be Zeicha to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Barab. He would have the schus to be Mekadesh, to go on Kiddush Hashem, like Rabbi Akiva wanted, the Gemara says, Matzah Yava, the other Vakayamena, when am I going to be Zeicha to V'haftat Hashem Alakecha B'chol Nafshecha, to be Maisa Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem, and Rabbi Akiva, in fact, was martyred. He was murdered Al Kiddush Hashem. So the Beis Yosef had been promised that he too would be Zeicha to be Maisa Nefesh Al Kiddush Hashem, which never happened. The Beis Yosef apparently did something that relative to the Madrega of the Beis Yosef, it was considered not good, inappropriate. And his Magid came and told him that he forfeited the schus to be Meisa Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. So what happened instead was that the Beis Yosef is Meinech Yamim, he lived a very, very long life. And during that incredibly long life, he wrote the most important Sfarim that Klal Yisrael has until Mashiach. A complete commentary on Rambam called Kesef Mishneh, a complete commentary on Torah called Beis Yosef, and a complete commentary, a Shulchan Aruch of his own, which the Beis Yosef is referred to in the whole Jewish world, even by Ashkenazim, as Moron. When you say our master, without specifying who your master is, Moron means the Beis Yosef, and certainly by Sfardim. So the Rebbe observed the punishment for forfeiting the Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem was to write such important Sfarim. It doesn't seem to add up. And the Rebbe concluded, and he said, this proves that when one individual Jew goes on Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, is martyred because he was Jewish, killed because he was a Jew, his influence on this world, not the heavenly world, on this world, is greater than the influence of having written a Kesef Mishnah and Rambam, a Beis Yosef and Torah and a Shulchan Aruch. Every Yid who is Meised Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, affects this world in so favorable a way that it is considered superior, his influence in Elam Hazeh, to having written the case of Mishnah, and Ramdan, the Beis Yosef, and Tur, and the Shulchan Aruch, which is powerful. And of course, just to mention the 6 million, the Kedoshim who were killed in Shnei Hazam, in the Holocaust, they were killed al Kiddush Hashem. There's no question about it. The Rebbe said once by Fabrengen, and I mentioned it in one of my classes, that this wasn't Jews being murdered. This was Jews sanctifying the name of God in public. And the Gemara says about the Harugi Melucha, the people who die al Kiddush Hashem, Ein Adam Yochad Lamed B'Mchitasa, nobody can be anywhere near them in Gan Eden. And the Gemara says, K'mei Rabbi Akiva v'Chaveirav, you mean like Rabbi Akiva and his friends who were Meised Nefesh al Kiddush? And the Gemara says, no, Rabbi Akiva and his Chaveirav had other milas. I mean a couple of Jews who had no milad, they were simple people who were Meised Nefesh to save somebody, and this chus puts them in a space which is higher than the biggest tzaddikim. In other words, in Jewish tradition, Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem is a sad part of our history, but it's not a waste. There's an incredible achievement, Lamato and Lamaila, here and in the higher worlds. Like the Rebbe always says, Leitokum Pamayim Tzara, Hoya Loiti, and not Chas V'Sholem, anybody is talking about Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem the way Rabbi Akiva did. We want to live V'chai Bohem, and this is the greatest Mesiras Nefesh, to be a Yid today, and to make another Yid into a Yid is the greatest way to live. But the idea that Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem is a waste is a mistake. And clearly when the Rebbe said that Siche, it was either 52 or 53, Yud Beis or Yud Gimel, he was saying it in conjunction with his father. Although his father passed away after he came back from his exile, but he was, I think, 66. And there's no doubt that he was killed because of his tzaras. He passed away far too young. He could have lived much longer. He was a very healthy man, a very strong man. And for a person of his energy and his health to pass away so exhausted at 66 was because he was destroyed by the Russians. I want you to know that when the Rebbe's mother came to New York, she brought him a photograph of her husband from the last period of his life. And she showed it to the Rebbe. And the Rebbe asked her who it was. And she said, "This is your father." And he couldn't believe how much his father had changed. In fact, in the Rebbe's library, they have a photograph, that picture, of the picture of Levi from the last years of his life, and on the back, the Rebbe wrote in his own handwriting, "My father?" ? He couldn't imagine how they had destroyed his father in those 5.5 short years. Recently, 20 years ago, 21 years ago, the Russian government gave out the file of the Rebbe's father's arrest. In fact, it was sent to the Rebbe. In it, an earlier picture of Rabbi Levi was discovered. And you understand why the Rebbe didn't recognize his father. Because you look at the two photographs, you say, this is the same person, separated by 5 years, it's impossible to fathom. He was completely destroyed, physically and morally destroyed by his arrest. And on Chof Menachem is his yahrtzeit. And we as Hasidim celebrate, we fabring on his yahrtzeit, of course because of our connection to the Rebbe, and naturally that gives us a connection to the Rebbe's father, and try to take something from it that we can use in our lives, that we can learn from. I want to begin with a cute story. There's a sefer called Yekatrinoslav, written by a great chassid, a big Rav, big Talmud Chacham, who was also a brilliant writer. His name was Rebbe Shmuel Sasonkin, Rebbe Shmuel Batumer. So he wrote a series of articles that after his passing were collected and put into a book called Yekatrinoslav. It's a wonderful read. You want to read a Hasidic Matzah Bechel from a Hasidic Yid that's alive, you should read Yekatrinoslav. And in it he tells the following story, that he was sent by the yeshivas Temchet Mimim to Yekatrinoslav, what is now called the Dnepropetrovsk, where the Rebbe's parents lived, to raise money for the yeshiva. When any of the Lubavitchers came to Dnepropetrovsk, they came to Yekatrinoslav, they would go to the Rebbe's parents' home. He was the Rav, he was a prominent Lubavitcher chassid, and a nice man, and of course if you needed a place to stay, that's where you would stay. So he knocked on the door. The Rebbetzin Chana, the Rebbe's mother, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak, opens the door, and Shmerel, Batumer Shmerel Sasonkin says to her, "Is Levik da? Is Levik home?" Now this was the tradition in Lubavitch. Even great chassidim, like Rabbi Levi, and Rabbi Levi was a giant, was called Levik. He wasn't Rebbe Levik, he wasn't Harav Rebbe Levik, he was not Harav Hagon HaKodesh HaTzadik. He was Levik. But the Rebbe Sanchana looked at this boy, and he felt right away that she was so disappointed by his lack of respect. And he stayed in their home for a while, and the entire time he felt this animus that Rebbetzin would not forgive her for referring to her husband as Levik. Many years later, both of them left Russia. They came to the West, and when he would meet her, that tina, that feeling of displeasure, it pervaded all the years, for many, many years, for decades. And it bothered him. So one year he lived in Yerushalayim. Rabbi Shmuel Sasonki lived in Yerushalayim. One year he happened to be in New York for Chofov, which was the Rebbe's father's yahrtzeit. And every year in Chofov, the Rebbe and Chana used to make a little gathering in her home. Hasidim would come. She would put down kibbutz, something to eat, and they would tell l'chaim. People would tell stories, and this was how she would commemorate her husband. So he was there, and he arranged to be invited to this mesiba, to this upbringing. He was a big rav, a big chassid, and he asked the Rebbe permission to say something. So she allowed him to say something, and he said that the Gemara says that kol rav mi Bavel. When a person is called rav, at H-Beis, rav, that means he was living in Bavel, which meant outside of Israel, he didn't really have the original smicha. Kol Rebbe Meretz Yisrael. Those who had smicha lived in the whole land were called Rebbe. A higher title even than Rebbe for the Nesiim was Rabbon, like Rabbon ben Gamliel and so forth. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And then the Gemara says, Godel mi Rabban Shmai. But the greatest of the great was not called, not the Rav, not the Rebbe, not the Rabban, they were called Shmai. Hillel, Shammai, Abaye, Rav, Shmuel, and so forth. So he explained that the greatest identification of a person is when you say his name and everybody knows who he is without having to apply any kind of a prefix. He says, and by Hasidim, that's how Hasidim addressed each other. Even the greatest Hasidim, they were not called Harav or Harav Reb, they were simply called by their name. This was the greatest sign of respect. And he said, for example, Levik, Chassidim called the Rebbe's father Levik. Everybody knew Levik was not Levik. He was a very big chassid, and a very big gon, and a very big tzaddik, and a big Oved Elikim. But this is how Chassidim felt about him, and that's how Chassidim referred to him. And he saw how the Rebbe and Chana forgave him for the 30-year-old grudge that she'd been holding because he dared call her husband Levik. He writes this in his Sefer. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, once in a Fabrengen, asked a similar question. He says, I grew up, the Rebbe says, I couldn't believe it. He didn't talk about his father, he talked about the Radatz. There was a very famous chassid, Reb David Hirschchein, who was Madregas Tzaddik. And Chassidim called him Hirschel. Hirschel the Rav, Hirschel Chenigever, Hirschel. Reb David Tzvi Chein was a Ga'an HaGoinim. It was a Gon and a Kodesh and a Tzaddik. And they called him Hirschel. And the Rebbe says, I couldn't understand, how could you call a person like this Hirschel? The Rebbe says, he remembers as a child, he says, then I figured it out, that the Chazal say, the Pasuk says, V'hoyu einecha reyes es meirecha, that a chassid always sees his Rebbe in front of him. And you're not allowed to give kavod to a Talmud next to a Rav. So although they were very big Chassidim and worthy of incredible kavod, nevertheless they were called Hirschel. And the same is true of Levik. It in no way was a sign of disrespect. He was Levik. And you watch the films of these old Russian Jews who are still alive today, who were children when Reb Levik was the Rav, and they call him Levik also, because apparently that's what people called Reb Levik. Levik in Yekatrinoslav, he was very well respected, very loved, and in many cases very feared. But he was Levik. Everybody had a connection to him that was very, very personal. That's the kind of a man he was. He was a man of incredible warmth. You read his correspondence with the Rebbe, overflowing with love, so unbelievably warm and full of love. Brilliant, very, very, very intelligent. And he literally was heilig neged ruchish al kol echad ve'echad. He found a language for each one. He found a different way to every person's heart. Even the people who hated him the most, ideologically, the communists and the socialists and the Yiddishists, the Zionists, on a personal level, they loved him. And that was the whole struggle in Yekatrinoslav. How do you hate what he stands for, but you love him. And I want you to know that's why he lasted so long. He was arrested in 1939. Most people were arrested in the 1920s for doing what he did. He lasted so long because all the Jewish communists, they couldn't help but love him. And as much as they hated him, they loved him. And it allowed him to do his work. And he stood like a rock against the Soviets. When the previous Rebbe left Russia, he was what was left behind as the leader, as the greatest representative of a Gadol B'Yisrael, who was going to be Meisei Nefesh for Yiddishkeit, and he was not going to bend an inch against the incredible evil that the Soviet system represented, and the Soviet system wrought on anybody who dared try to preserve and to continue Yiddishkeit in that country. It's difficult for us to understand how great Rebbe Levi was. The Gemara's expression is "Ktana avim imasneinu." The little things of Rebbe Levi, the things that were not so important for him, were much greater than we'll ever achieve. He was a gadol. To say he knew Kol HaTorah, you read his writings that he wrote while he was away. He had no Sfarim, and he knows the Shas and the Yerushalmi and the Medrashim and the Zayah and the Kabbalah by heart. He's quoting it all from memory. He had an incredible mind. He was a great God. And as we know, was Amir Makubal. His whole life was Kabbalah. And when he spoke Kabbalah. When he wrote Kabbalah. Nobody knew what he's talking about, but nevertheless, this is what he did. Somebody asked him, "Hey, Minayin Lach, how do you know so much Kabbalah?" So he said, "I was taught." But the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was his Rebbe, to whom he was dedicated as a real chassid, gave him Kabbalah. So they said to him, if you add up all the time you spent in Lubavitch and all of your visits, it doesn't explain how you expound on Kabbalah so prolifically. It was like a fountain of Kabbalah. So Rabbi Levi says, Klolim. I was given principles. I was taught how to study Kabbalah. But Rabbi Levi was a makubal. His writings are saturated with Kabbalah, and it mamish is a mayan amis gaber. You see how much it is. It's incredible. And he was an ovid. He was a chassid. He served the Eibishter. In other words, to him, it wasn't the learning and the Kabbalah, it was the connection to Hashem. And then eventually, when he became a Rav, it became his service. He was a shepherd. He was a Rei Yisrael. He had a flock. And he ran his Rabbonos Barama. He was a Rav for 30 years in a very difficult time, in a very difficult city, of a very difficult nation, namely a bunch of Jews. And he did his Rabbonos with an incredible taikif, as we'll discuss Mitzvah Shem soon a little bit. And in addition to his own milas, he was also a Moirindik and Meyuchas. He was a Tzemach Tzedek Sanenikel. And he was from Ravash, from the oldest of the Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek is the third Lubavitcher Rebbe. He was from the oldest son of the Tzemach Tzedek, while the Rebbe Marash was the youngest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was from the youngest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. Rebbe Levi was from the oldest of the Tzemach Tzedek's children. So although they were the same age, the previous Rebbe was the fourth from the Tzemach Tzedek, and he was the fifth from the Tzemach Tzedek. His father was Rabbi Schneer. Rabbi Schneer's diary was preserved. He sent it to the previous Rebbe as a gift, and it's been published. In fact, there are two published versions of it. Very interesting diary. You learn about a man. This is the Rebbe's grandfather, the Rebbe's paternal grandfather. He was a very big chassid, a very, very big Talmud Chacham, a very big God. Ish Sameach, a happy man. Chassidim Yudel Chitrik describes him as a freilich erid. But he knew so much, and it was all so natural. They didn't make so much of themselves. They knew Kol HaTorah Kula, and it was like no big deal. They were chassidim. They served the Eibishter, they were connected to their Rebbe. Yudel Chittik describes how they were sitting on a train, an all-nighter. And the Baruch Shalom says, Baruch Schneer says, someone has to chazer a maimer. So nobody has a maimer. So he said a maimer, a discourse of Chassidus. And when he finished, they sang a niggin. They were happy for a few minutes. Says, someone's got to say a maimer. We have time still. So he said another one. And he was like that kind of a person. He used to say that Baruch Schneer, he never had a job. He was what they call a b'nei tevim. He was a kind of a yid who sat kol yom val teira val aveda. He was supported, I'm imagining, when he was a young man by his father-in-law. And in the later years, he got a stipend from Lubavitch. The Rebbe Rashab used to support him. His name was actually Schneer Zalman. But he married a woman whose father was Schneer Zalman. And in Tzavos, Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, you're not supposed to marry somebody whose father has the same name. So he added the name Baruch. And Baruch Schneer became so predominant that the Zalman was forgotten. But his original name was actually Schneer Zalman. And this was Rebbe Levi's father. And he used to say that I was never given a Rabbanus. The Rebbe Rashab gave my sons a Rabbanusen. I'm not sure who did better. Maybe I did better without my job than them with their jobs. First of all, Panasa they didn't have. And Vashenis Tzorasam Zigahat Onashir. The problems that came along with Rabbanus in those days, especially, without a limit, without an end. And this was Rebbe Levi's father. Rebbe Levi married the Rebbe Tzimchana. She was also a Meyucheses. Her father was Rebbe Shlomo Yanovsky. He was the Rav of Nikolaev, which was a pretty big city in the Ukraine with a very large Lubavitcher Hasidic population. And Rebbe Shlomo had inherited the position from his grandfather-in-law. Rebbe Avram David Lavut was a big Gaon, a Gaon Olam, who wrote Moeden Dike Sfarim. And Rebbe Avram David Lavut left in his tzavah that when he passes, he wants that his grandson should be Mamale Mekemi. Rebbe Shlomo was the Rebbe's maternal grandfather, and the Rebbe Tzanchana was the Rebbe's mother. And when Rebbe Levik, or Levik as Hasidim call him, married the Rebbe Tzanchana, he moved to Nikolaev, and he lived by his shver, by his father-in-law, and that's where his children, all three of his sons, were born in Nikolaev. Our Rebbe was born in Nikolaev. And during the Nikolaev years, he was living there about 10 or 11 years, all he did was learn and daven, day and night, al Torah v'al Avodah. And Chassidim describe how even old men would wait to watch Rabbi Levi coming from the mikveh and watch him to go prepare himself for davening, because notwithstanding that he was a young man, he was in his 20s. Yeah, he was in his 20s. He was Chodosh Mola Yoshan. As young as he was filled with the best wine, and people would take in the presence of Rabbi Levi. But his peace lasted a decade. And in Tafrei Samachtas, he was given the Rabbanos in Yekatrinoslav, which is a story unto itself. Let's just say that becoming Rav in Yekatrinoslav was not an honor you wanted, unless you were crazy, because it came along with such unbelievable hardship. It's a terrible Rabbanos at a terrible time, and he became Rav in Yekatrinoslav not because he was looking for a job, but because his Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, said, there's a vacancy, you're going to fill it. And he filled it very capably. Yekatrinoslav was a very interesting city. It's in the south of Russia, in the warmer parts of Russia. And it's one of the few places where Jews lived in numbers during the time of the Pale of the settlement. What's called Gzedas Tchum HaMoshav. Jews were not allowed to live all over Russia. They were only able to live inland and away from big cities and away from borders, because, of course, the Russians loved them so much, they didn't want them to be near any enemies, God forbid, you understand. And Jews who were wealthy, well-to-do, would get special permissions to live in big cities. There was a rich man who had permission to live in Yekatrinoslav, later to be called Dnepropetrovsk, and he wanted a kehillah of Yidden. He wanted to bring Yidden to the big city where there was opportunity to make a living and to live like a mensch. So he made puppet businesses, fronts, as if he has all these different businesses and he needs all this employment. And he got permission from the Russian government to import many, many Jews, and that's where they lived. And for many years, maybe from the 1820s until the Holocaust, till 1940, so well over 100 years, there was a large Jewish population in the city of Yekatrinoslav, later to be called Dnepropetrovsk. The community of Jews in Yekatrinoslav had a lot of Lubavitcher Hasidim, and always had a Lubavitcher Rov. The Rabbeim always saw to it that the Rov should be a Lubavitcher. In Tafrei Samachtas in 1909, the former Rav, whose name was Rebbe Wolf Kozevnikov, Rebbe Doiv Ze'ev Kozevnikov of Yekatrinoslav, died. He was a chassid from Tzemach Tzedek. He's a story unto himself. There's much to tell, but there isn't much time. And when he passed away, the position became vacant, and there were so many types of Jews, and everybody immediately wanted that the vacancy should be filled by a member of their community. You had the Hasidim, you had the Misnagdim, you had different types of Hasidim. Then you had the modern Jews and the Freie Jews and all the isms. It was an age of revolution. Everybody was believing in change and in hope. And there were, 20 factions fighting over the position. And they were not just fighting over who would be Rav, but they were fighting over power in the community. Because remember, in the Tsarist Russia, a Rav had official legal power from the government. And the Rebbe Rashab, who was a very powerful Jew in Russia at that time, fought and made sure that the position would be held by a Lubavitcher Chassid. There was always a Lubavitcher Rav in Yekatrinoslav. They would continue being a Lubavitcher Rav in Yekatrinoslav. And he sent them Rabbi Levi, who, as it turned out, was an incredibly qualified candidate. And like I said to you before, they may have hated what he stood for, but they certainly loved him personally because he was such a Gaon and such a Chacham and so forth. And he became Rav in Yekatrinoslav. And he moved his family from the protective, warm Hasidic world of Nikolaev to the very, very public and dynamic and exposed world of Yekatrinoslav. Now, just interesting to note that in the last few months, a new volume of letters, of correspondence, of Igreis Kodesh from the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, was published. And in this new volume, there are a series of letters from the Rebbe Rashab to Rabbi Levi, to the Rebbe's father. And one of the letters talks about his smicha, where it was necessary for Rabbi Levi to get smicha from the Reb Chaim Brisker, who was a Godel v'Yisrael, and he was a Litvak, a Misnagid. And the Rebbe Rashab says to Rabbi Levi, you should go to Brisk, and he will certainly give you the smicha, you deserve the smicha. And he writes, Ki hu yiras shamayim be'emes. Reb Chaim was not a Misnagid at all. He was an Eilamish, he was a Litvak, but he had no hate, he had no animus whatsoever. He was a God-fearing man. Chaim Brisker was an unbelievably humble man and a kind man, and lived like a simple person, even though he was a Gadol Amiti. He was an incredible Jew, incredible Jew. And him and the Rebbe Rashab were Poshet friends. They loved each other. And the Rebbe Rashab says to the Rebbe's father, I'm looking for a reason to write him, but I haven't found one. In other words, the Rebbe was sensitive. He couldn't just write to Chaim a letter and say, I'm sending you one of my Talmidim, give him smicha. He didn't have that kind of relationship. It had to be more respectful. So he needed an opportunity where he could include in some other correspondence, by the way, Rabbi Levi is coming to you, and he's very capable, and a kenasach Lenin, and he's worthy of smicha, and so forth. And Rabbi Levi had smicha from Rabbi Chaim Brisker, and a few other smichas, all in preparation for his rabbanis, and he became the Rav in Yekatrinoslav in Tafrei Samachtes in 1909. And the Rebbe Tzanchana, his wife, would say that as busy as he was, and as involved as the work of rabbanis was, they got a very large apartment, which they held until the revolution, when the apartment was cut in half. And every one of their boys, they had 3 sons, was given a little private room for themselves. And they would sit in this room, Yomam v'Layla, and learn Torah. The Rebbe and his brothers had incredible minds, unbelievable minds. And as busy as their house was, and as tumultuous as what the times were, they sat in their rooms over the Gemara and learned Torah, completely oblivious to what was going on in the world. And this was one of the things that the Leivik and the Rebbe Tzanchana saw to it, that notwithstanding that they were so preoccupied, their children should be able to continue their education, to grow up to be Lomdim and Yirei Shamayim and Chasidim. And that's how the Rebbe was raised. Our Rebbe was raised in this kind of an environment. Rebbe Leivik was involved in every parsha, in every affair that his Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, was involved with. He was one of the leading Rabbonim who supported the efforts of their Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab. There was another very famous chassid named Reb Mendel Chaim. He was a Nezhener of. He was killed al Kiddush Hashem b'Pashtus. He too was a stalwart, was a rock that stood with the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, to carry out what he wished, what he thought as necessary. I mean, to give you a couple of examples, Alilas Dam Beilis, the famous blood libel of Mendel Beilis, which is such a famous story. The Lubavitcher Rebbe was very involved in that story. He had to clear up the accusation that Mekubalim used, God forbid, Christian blood for matzahs and so forth. Rebbe Leivik was the one who did the research and provided the lawyers with the information from Kabbalah sources that this is so nonsensical that the Jews are using blood for matzahs. He was also involved in the famous Asifas Arabana that took place in Tafresh Ayin Alf, 1910, 1911. It was a very famous meeting where all the big, important Rabbanim of Russia gathered, and of course, Reb Chaim Brisker was there, the Rebbe Rashab was there, and they talked about the future of Rabbanis in Russia, based on the government's desire to interfere with Rabbanim and make Rabbanim get some kind of a secular education. Reb Leivik was involved in that as well. In any serious public service endeavor that his Rebbe, the Rebbe Rashab, was busy with, he too, in addition to his Rabbanis, was involved with. He came to Yekatrinoslav. I think there were 20 shuls, and there were all kinds of organizations, children's schools and adult schools and Bikir Chaylims and Lahavdul Havoyas Hameis, and Jewish communities in the old country were very, very organized. You know, like in Germany they call it the Gemeinde. I don't know what words they used in Russia, but it was a similar idea. There was a certain measure of sovereignty. Jewish communities governed themselves, and they taxed. The government gave them money to support community affairs, and Rebbe Leivik, as the Rav, was the leader of all of this. He had a lot of power and he had a lot of responsibility, and I understand that he would daven in various shuls and make speeches in different shuls, although he davened in one shul, in a very large shul in Yekatrinoslav, and ironically, the shul where Rebbe Leivik davened consistently davened Nusach Ashkenaz. It wasn't even a Lubavitcher shul, it was a modern shul, a frum shul obviously, and this is where the Rebbe grew up, this is where the Rebbe davened for many, many years, as a child and as a teenager. This is where Rebbe Leivik was the Rav, and this is where they davened and so forth. And as I said to you before, There were so many different types of Jews. Very frum, very secular. Everybody was busy with a cause. And everybody was competing for control. And Rebbe Levi held the community. And he made it bend to his will, which nobody liked, except those people who agreed with him, of course. But you loved him anyway. They hated what he stood for, but they loved him. They loved him because he was such a smart, kind person. And he found the way to each person's heart. I want you to know that when the Russians were going to come and arrest him, the agents whose task it was to arrest him would tell their mother that tonight we're going to arrest Levi, so they would warn him not to sleep at home. I mean, this is how he lasted, because they hated him and they loved him. They hated what he stood for, but they loved him personally. And they looked after him. In the end, they looked after him, Rebbe Levi. And like I said to you before, his Rabbanos lasted for 30 years. Rebbe Levi would make speeches. Now, when the difficult times began in the late 1910s, the revolution, and then the crackdown against religion, Rebbe Levi, like the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, dedicated all of his talks to Yiddishkeit, Mesiras Nefesh, not the bend. But when things were more peaceful, and Rebbe Levi would make speeches, he would speak Kabbalah, and no one knew what's flying, and no one knew what's going on. Just talk. He talked for 45 minutes in Kabbalah, and people sat, they had respect. So he would talk, and nobody listened. So somebody once said to Rebbe Levi, I says, with all due respect, to whom are you talking? And Rebbe Levi could say, I'm talking to a little boy in the corner. His son, our Rebbe, was a kid before Bar Mitzvah. He would sit in the corner and listen, and Rebbe Levi was talking to him. It's written in a sefer called Yemei Melech that Rebbe Levi would speak Kabbalah for a long time. And he would stop, and he would turn to his son, the Rebbe, our Rebbe was a boy, and say to him, Nu, Hatoma, give it flavor. And the Rebbe would quote sources, Makoides, for everything Rebbe Levi had said. And very often Rebbe Levi would say, I didn't think of this source, I didn't know this source. The Rebbe's Bekiyas was Al Derech HaPela, Hafla V'Fela. This was the kind of home it was. People say, the Rebbe Tzanchana used to say that there was arguments all the time between the three of them, the Rebbe's father, the Rebbe, and the youngest brother, Label. The Friedrich Rebbe, the Rebbe's father spoke in the language of Kabbalah, the Rebbe spoke in the language of Chassidus, and the Label spoke in the language of philosophy, Chkira. They understood each other. They were saying the same thing. Each one was speaking from his perspective, from his world. These were the kinds of conversations that they engaged in. The Rebbe's father. When World War I happened, tens of thousands of Jews ran away from the front. They came from Galicia because Jews could not live on a border. And of course, the Eastern Front was very fluid. It was constantly moving. And any time the front moved that was near a Jewish community, the Jews had to evacuate. There was also issues with kidnappings. It's a long, bitter story. The end of it was that tens of thousands of Jews, immigrants, arrived in Yekatrinoslav. You know what it means to absorb tens of thousands of Jews? As large as the community of the Dnepropetrovsk may have been. Tens of thousands of Jews. The Rebbe says, I saw my mother. I've never seen her like this before or since. She suddenly showed such energy and such capability. She ran the entire project. They provided food and lodging and education for all of the immigrants. Bechovet, they all felt comfortable. In fact, there have been many reports written about that period where people who are not from at all would say that Harav Schneerson's children looked after us. Harav Schneerson's children is our Rebbe and his brothers. And it was a very, very difficult period, and it was a time that the Rebbe and his family completely dedicated themselves to help the Platim, the refugees who had come east because of the war. And of course, when the war ended, they left. They went back to their native lands. Unfortunately, they didn't find the same situation that they had left prior to the war, but they went back home. But this was a very, very significant period of the Rebbe's childhood and early adulthood. When the revolution, the Bolshevik revolution happened, and they began to crack down against Yiddishkeit, the first people to suffer were the Rabbonim, the Shochtim, the Malamdim. Anybody who was involved in holy affairs was immediately pressured. You have to work. And Rebbe Levi stood like a rock. All of his speeches during those years talked about Mesiras Nefesh, and we're not going to budge an inch. And he encouraged Jews to continue their identity as Jews, not to be, chas v'sholem, discouraged or frightened away by the pressure that were brought to bear. And he represented, he was a model, he was a prototype of of not bending, of not kneeling and not bending, of great Mesiras Nefesh. Our Rebbe said once in a upbringing that somebody had threatened the Rebbe. Some Jew had threatened the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, I grew up in Sovietish Rusland. I grew up in Soviet Russia. And I was the oldest son of the Rav, he said. And many times I was called in for cross-examinations as the oldest son of the Rav to find out what kind of activities my family was busy with. And the Rebbe said, and I wasn't afraid of them. I'm going to be afraid of him. He's going to frighten me. He's going to with Matzah. The Rebbe said, we grew up without fear, pride. They stood like a rock to preserve Yiddishkeit without any bending whatsoever. There's a story that they had on the Living Torah a couple of years ago. I think it's in the early years videos. Could be. The Rav Ashkenazi from Kfar Chabad related that he knew Reb Nachum Goldschmidt, who was a childhood friend of the Rebbe's. They learned together in Cheder. So he told him the following story. That sometime during the 1930s, Rebbe Levi came to Kharkov. Kharkov was a large city in the Ukraine. Why did he come to Kharkov? Because the Russian government had invited all Rabbanim from the Ukraine to a meeting. And the purpose of the meeting was to get them to sign that there's no Redifas Hadas in Rusland, which means that there's no religious persecution. The Jews are free to practice religion and so forth. Obviously, it was a blatant lie, but they were pressuring the Rabbanim to sign that there's no Redifas Hadas, that there's no anti-religious activities going on in the Soviet Union. And of course, they used it for propaganda. So this Reb Nachum Goldschmidt was in yeshiva in Kharkiv. There was an underground yeshiva, Temech Mimim in Kharkiv at that time. And so when Rebbe Levi came to Kharkiv, the Mashgiach, Rebbe Kunitzer, Rebbe Garfinkel, who was a very special chassid, heard that the Rebbe's father, who was then the previous Rebbe's Mechutin, was in Kharkiv. So he found him, and he brought him to the yeshiva to see the Talmidim. And he came in and he sat with the Bacharim. He started speaking to them Nigle, and they couldn't understand what he was saying, so he started speaking Kabbalah, and that's the Yafashtanen, don't ask me. But he sat next to Reb Nachum Goldschmidt. Nachum Goldschmidt was a landslide. Nachum Goldschmidt was a local, was from his town. And when he left, Reb Nachum accompanied him back to his hotel. When they came into the hotel, Reb Nachum Goldschmidt saw that the government invited him to a meeting, so they provided him with accommodations. The room was tiny. There was a bed and a table, and there was no room. Rebbe Levi sat down on the chair, and he was just exhausted. He was just worn out. So Reb Nachum says to Rebbe Levi, why don't you lay down? And Rebbe Levi says to Ich weiß nicht, wer hat da gelegt die Kopf Nacht. Who slept in this bed yesterday and last week? How can I sleep in this bed? And Reb Nachum realized that the whole 3 weeks that Rebbe Levi was in Kharkiv, he slept sitting in a chair. He didn't want to lay in the bed. So he would explain, it was meant that our Rebbe is Kodesh Merechem U'Meleda. This is the Rebbe's father, the Kedusha. He didn't want to sleep in a bed that who knows who slept in, you understand? And Rebbe Levi says to him, "The Veis of Asichman, you know why I'm here?" He says, "No, I don't know why you're here." He says, "I'll tell you why I'm here. The Russian government called all the Rabbanim of the Ukraine together, and they want us to sign an official letter declaring that there's no Redifas Hadas in Russia. That in Russia, a Jew who wants to practice religion is free to practice Yiddishkeit." And Rebbe Levi says, "Should I sign or should I not sign?" And Nachman says, "I'm watching him. He's talking to himself while I'm in the room. If I sign, then maybe they'll ease off a little bit. They'll see that we're cooperating. They'll make life easier for us. But if I sign, on the other hand, this will allow them a free hand to persecute us further. If the Rabbanim themselves are saying that there's no religious persecution." And Rebbe Levi talked his way through this conversation with himself out loud. Should I sign? Should I not sign? And this went on for some time. And then Rebbe Levi stood up. He says, "Nein, ich will nicht chasmen. Absolutely not. I won't sign. Yaver ma. I don't care what they'll do to me. I will not sign." Reb Nachum Goldschmidt said, "I saw what Schneerson is. The Schneersonske Stolz. Schneersons are famous for their stubbornness. You can move Mount Everest easier than you can move a Schneerson." He thought it through. He waited. He says, "This is wrong. I'm not going to sign." And he didn't. This was the kind of man he was. This was the kind of the Rabbanis that he had. Now, one of the things that's very significant in the life of the Rebbe's parents is the Rebbe's departure. The Rebbe left Russia, and when he left Russia, his brother Leibel also left. And they left their parents with their third brother, who was not well, named Berel. Unfortunately, Berel was killed by the Nazis. He has no grave at all. They're publishing now the Rebbe's mother's journal. And in it, she's writing about her son Berel, that she's afraid to even think what's going on with him. She wishes she could ask. She has nobody that she can share it with. The only person who would understand is her son, our Rebbe, and she didn't want to burden him because the Rebbe had so many other responsibilities. And she agonizes over the fact that she doesn't even know if he's alive or dead. And this was very painful to the Rebbe's parents, but it had to be. The Rebbe was going to marry the previous Rebbe's daughter, the Rebbe's Nechaya Mushka. I don't know if it's true, that I heard that the Rebbe once said to his mother, I'll never forgive myself for leaving Russia and leaving you behind. These are special people. Special people have special connections. And they were separated for all these years. The Rebbe was never to see his father again and so forth. Now Rabbi Levi was a Rav for 30 years. About 20 of those years, close to 20 of those years at least, were spent under the Bolsheviks. And the entire time, he was a constant, a rock for Yiddishkeit. And if anybody needed something to lean on, Leivik was there to lean on it. And as our Rebbe explained so often, the initiative that defined him was Matzah. The Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, although Stalin managed to destroy that also. All the wheat in Russia came from the Ukraine. And consequently, the matzahs that had to be baked in Russia were baked in the Ukraine. And Rabbi Levi would always see the matzah baking. And if there were all kinds of problems, a wagon load of wheat came and it turned out to be a leak in the car, and the matzah the flour got wet, which made it chametz. And Rabbi Levi didn't want to use it. And the government said that this is all there is. Levi said, it's not kosher, I need new wheat. And they told him, if you throw away this wheat, you're costing the people money. And Levi said, I don't care, I need kosher wheat. And they wouldn't give it to him. He traveled to Moscow, he met with Kalinin, the president of Russia, and they arranged to give a noosh wagon load of wheat, along with a letter that said that Harav Schneerson, with his mashgichim, his overseers, are responsible to see that the matzahs are made kedas v'kadin, and everybody has to bend to the will of Harav Schneerson when it comes to making the matzahs. This was such a patch upon him, such a slap in the face to a Soviet system that controlled people out of fear. And here was a Rav who simply refused to be afraid. Year after year after year, he provided matzah for Russian Jews, and he paid with his life for it. Rabbi Levi was arrested a week before Pesach, and there's no question that his arrest came because of his latest matzah war that he had fought with the Soviets. And by the way, if you think about it in retrospect, had he stayed behind the Yekatrinoslav, he probably would have gotten caught in the Nazi web. But that's another story. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, explained once in a upbringing why his father was so preoccupied with matzah. Of all mitzvahs, why did he pick matzah? And he said a wonderful thing. He says that the Zohar says that matzah is the food of faith. It doesn't only mean that when you eat matzah, it helps you with faith. When you're eating matzah, you're literally eating emunah. That Rabbi Levi knew that the Gachelas HaYahadas, Jews who just a generation before were all from, Russian Jews were from predominantly, who were now suddenly Nebuch, all not from. In Mamish, in 1 or 2 generations, the turnaround is indescribable. It's very difficult to expect them to keep Taryag mitzvahs. Let them at least have emunah. And Rabbi Levi invested his life and paid with his life for kosher and matzah. A yid should eat a piece of matzah, and maybe there'll be a little flicker of emunah from his neshama that he can pass along to his generation. For a better time when Yiddishkeit will be able to be revived in Russia. And it's interesting that one of the first cities in Russia that had a Lubavitcher Shliach in more recent times, after the Soviet Union started to fall to pieces, was the Dnepropetrovsk, Yekatrinoslav. And the Rebbe would refer to it as Iri, my city. And one of the great success stories of Lubavitcher Russia, Lubavitch in Russia, B'chalal, is an unbelievably successful story. But in Dnepropetrovsk, the Rebbe's city has an incredible Lubavitcher presence. And as the Rebbe sees it, I imagine the koiches that his father invested are bearing fruit. All these decades later, after all of the tzadis and all the Ibel admonition, there's a lot of Yiddishkeit in Russia today. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Yidden who need more Yiddishkeit, but there's a lot of Yiddishkeit in Russia today. And Rabbi Levi was feeding Yidden matzahs 70 years ago, that today a Yid should know he's Jewish and want to bris or marry a Jew, which is already for many, many people, a very big thing, but a very, very high madrege. The Rebbe's father was arrested, I think, Tes Nissen. Tzadik Tes, 1939. They came, of course, as was their custom, in the middle of the night. They wanted to arrest him many times. But I said to you earlier that many times he would be warned, don't sleep at home tonight. And when they came to get him, he wasn't there. This time they got him. He took with him a few pounds of matzahs and he disappeared. The Rebbe's mother, his wife, immediately went looking for him and she couldn't find him. She spent weeks and weeks until she was able to track him down in a prison and send him things, send him some sfarim, send him some food. I think he spent 7 months in jails. He was in 5 different jails, but he was in one of those jails twice. He had been moved back and forth. At the end of this 6 or 7 months period, he was sentenced to 5 years of exile, but it was retroactive. In other words, the 6 or so months that he spent in jail were included in the sentence. So he was sent off to his exile at the end of the year, let's say, but it was retroactive from before Pesach. So exactly 5 years later, 1944, before Pesach, he was let go and he moved to the city of Almatah, where he lived for the last 5 months of his life, and he passed away in 1944 in the summer in the city of Almatah on Chof Menachem Av, on the 20th of Av, which is today, his yahrtzeit. So there's a Likutei Sichos. There's a Sicha from the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos, based on an essay that his father wrote. The Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi, wrote a page that begins with the words, Ani Levi Yitzchak ben Zelda. I, Levi Yitzchak, the son of Zelda. And he describes his life story and proceeds to explain the details of his life according to Kabbalah, including why he sat in 5 prisons, goes against the Hegvudas, and one of the prisons he was twice. Every detail, the name Levi and the name Yitzchak and the name Zelda, every little detail of his life he explains mystically. I mean, you go explain your life up in Kabbalah. You don't know how to hold the books. A whole, very profound, and Kabbalah is like mathematics. It's very, very concise. It's written in code, If you were to explain that one page, it would be a book. A whole explanation of his entire life based on Kabbalah. Why he's suffering, Gvuras, a whole business. So our Rebbe, his son, once said, when you read this, and it's printed in the Likutei Sichos, when you read this page, 2 things strike you. On the one hand, an unbelievable humility. Here's a man who's suffering miserably. And he understands his suffering. He understands, as kumtam. Somehow, for some mystical reason, it's coming to him. But at the same time, you see such a shtol, such a go'in. This is a yid who believes that everything that happens in his life can be explained al pi Torah. His personal life is based on Torah. And the Rebbe develops an insight into who his father was based on this essay. He says, my father was an unbelievably humble man. And at the same time, he was a rock of fearlessness and go'in, pride for Jews and Judaism, that gave support to so many people. And this dichotomy, this duality, existed unbelievably well in the person that was Rabbi Levi. His wife, our Rebbe Chana, is this, immediately left Yekatrinoslav to join him in his exile in Almatah. Unfortunately, she had to leave her son behind. She asked a woman named Rachel, I just saw this now, it came out this week, or several weeks ago, they're publishing her journal. And she has no idea what became of him, she has no idea what became of her, to join her husband. And she devoted the 4.5 years of his exile to make life bearable for him. There was nothing to eat. You had to find him food. He had no sfarim, had no pen, had no paper. And she did everything in her power to make his life 1 drop more bearable. He used to write Chidush Torah on the margins of the few sfarim that he had. He had a set of Zayar and a Chumash and a Mishnayos. And he wrote very concisely because he knew he didn't have enough room. And she used to make ink from herbs, from berries, which is why if you've ever been to the Rebbe's library and you can see the original of these documents, you have fluorescent pink ink, fluorescent orange, fluorescent green, the weirdest colors, because it wasn't that Rabbi Levi had a 10-colored pen. He liked to write in diverse colors. He was pashut writing with whatever ink his wife provided for him, and he wrote the Chidush Torah. These Chidush Torah eventually were smuggled out of Russia, and our Rebbe, for 20 years or so, every Shabbos in Kibbutz Av would speak on one of the thoughts of his father, first on Tanya and then later on the Zohar. And of course, along with that, every single Shabbos after his mother passed away, he would say a Rashi, Leila Nishmas, his mother. So the Rebbe did something for his mother all the years. He learned Chumash Rashi. And for his father, he learned his father's Biyurim and Tanya, and then later on Levi Yitzchak on Zohar. He spent 5 years in this exile, so alone. There was a Yid by the name Hershel Rabinovich. He wasn't even a Lubavitcher Chassid, but he was a frumme Chassidish, a flamfeidige Yid. He helped them incredibly. His story is a very, very, it's a storybook. It's a story of unbelievable Mesiras Nefesh. There's much to say about him. And there were a few others, but for the most part they were alone. He describes Simchas Torah. He took his Mishnayos and his Zohar, and he danced by himself a whole night singing in that tiny little room in the mosquito-infested Far East, you understand? But he wasn't breakable. Physically, they destroyed him. They killed him. But spiritually, he was the same man. And after 5 years, right before Pesach, Tafshin Dalet, 1944, he was allowed to leave his exile in the city of Chile, which is in the Far East someplace, Kazakhstan, I believe, and he moved to Almaty, which was a larger city in Kazakhstan that had a Jewish community, a shul, and Lahavdla cemetery. Rabbi Levi was greeted with open arms. There were a lot of Lubavitcher Hasidim there, and now there were people who could take care of him. And of course, the first order of business was a medical doctor. A doctor examined Rabbi Levi immediately, and he obviously discovered that he was very, very ill. I've heard that he had Yena Machle. He was very, very sick. And he put him on a liquid diet to preserve long. I mean, he couldn't operate in 1944. I mean, who knew? You know, medicine has come a long way since then. But at least if he won't eat solids, it'll be better for him. And he sees that there's a whole pile of matzahs and mother and charesis and karpas right before Pesach. And he turns to Rabbi Levi and says, "Du gehst das nicht essen. You're not eating this. I mean, this will kill you." Sagt Rabbi Levi, "Das geht nicht rein in Cheshbon." This is not part of the conversation. Matzah is not food, it's a mitzvah. Mother is not food, it's a mitzvah. And of course, he ate the shiurim, no question. He would live 5 more months. And he deteriorated slowly. During this period, the people there got to love him. He would go to shul. Shavuos, he spoke to the children. And he spoke to the children about Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. And he brought out the point of B'neinu, Erevim Ba'adeinu, the children are the future. That in spite of all the hardships, children have to know that they're Yidden. And they have to educate themselves, if need be, to grow up to be Jews and to be the next generation of soldiers to preserve Yiddishkeit in Russia. One of the most interesting stories that I heard was, there's a young man, Raskin, who was a son of Rabbi Yossi Raskin, a famous chassid who lived in Almaty, who helped the Rebbe's father. And the Rebbe was always makar teva to him and to his children. Went Erev Tisha B'Av to bring the Rebbe's parents food before the fast and after the fast. They were very dependent upon others. So this young boy, was a teenager, he's 18, 19, 20 years old, takes a bag full of food, he leaves his parents home and he goes to the Levi, and he brings him food. And Rabbi Levi starts a conversation with him. In Kabbalah of all things, and of course the boy understood absolutely nothing. And Rabbi Levi is talking and talking and talking. And the Rebbe Tzanchana, the Rebbe's mother, says to him, "You have to eat and he has to eat, it's almost a fast." And he keeps talking. To make a long story short, neither of them ate before the Tanis. And I would imagine that the Rebbe Tzanchana didn't eat without her husband, and she didn't eat either. The boy leaves the house, it was already dark, it was night, Tisha B'Av, and he hadn't eaten. He comes home, he walks through the door, his mother falls on him and she hugs him and she kisses him 50 times and you have no idea what happened. They came from the recruitment to take you to the front. Had he gone to the front, in all likelihood, he never would have come home. And Rebbe Levi was saying Kabbalah, you understand? Rebbe Levi was saying Kabbalah, saved the boy's life, just to give you an idea. He passed away Chafov. As soon as he passed away, the whole community came. And there was a woman named Altes who was interviewed about 20 years ago. It was printed in a magazine called, I forgot what it was called. It was a magazine that came out in Crown Heights 20 years ago that had an interview with her. I forgot the name of the magazine. And she was a girl, she was a teenager. I think her name was Altais, maybe Klovgant, I'm not sure, one of those names. A Russian Jewess. She walked into the house and she became hysterical. she started to scream. Everybody was so laden with tzaras. Who didn't have losses? And Rebbe Levi was such a special man. And at the end of the war, to lose him, she melted down. She just broke down. And she started screaming. The Rebbe's mother, the Rebbe Tzimchana, who had suffered the greatest loss, who had the most reason to cry, turns to this young lady and says to her, "Bei Yidden schreit man nicht. We're Jews. We don't lose it. We don't become hysterical. We don't scream." She repeated the story almost 50 years later. That's how much of an imprint, of an impact it had on her. I don't think she was even a frum woman later in life, but the Rebbe Tzimchana left her with that. Yidden, we don't lose it. Man schreit nicht. For the Rebbe Tzimchana, this was like losing her whole world. Rabbi Levi was laid to rest in Matzah, and that's where he is ad hayom hazeh. And there was Jews who looked after his tzion and guarded it and protected it, that it should be treated with respect for many, many years. There was a Yid, Nimoitin, Rabbi Yosef Nimoitin, who lived in Yekatrinoslav in Almatah, and for many, many years he looked after the Rebbe's father's tzion, the Heilig Art as he called it. And when he came to America, the Rebbe was in love with him. The Rebbe told him, "I'm indebted to you, and I want to continue paying you, and I want to never finish being indebted to you for what you did for my father." That was the kind of feeling of hakaras hatov the Rebbe felt towards those people who showed respect to his parents. And the Rebbe Tzimchana slept back to Yekatrinoslav. There was nothing for her left, nothing. She had left his Sfarim. His Sfarim were buried under a house, you understand? Half of it was used for firewood. A Goyish family moved into the house. They used the Sfarim for firewood, in the war. And the other half of the Sfarim were buried under the ground, and then the Russians built a complex on top of it. Those books may still one day be found. Russian buildings that don't last very long, but they were buried under the house, Fatik. She moved to Moscow, and then she was encouraged by Mumasada and others during the years of running away that she should leave Russia, which she did. She took along the most precious of her husband's belongings, and of course eventually she met her son. The Rebbe came to France in 1947 to see his mother. He spent 3 months with her, and he brought her back with him to the United States. And she lived 17 years in that shadow. And some of the happiest years of her life were spent living with her son, who was eventually to become the Rebbe. And she was the Rebbe's mother, the Rebbe Tzimchana. This is some stories, a little window into the personality of Rebbe Levi. And again, if you want to take something from it, the thing that I think is most important for people like you and me to learn from such a person, in addition to the Jewish pride, in addition to the Jewish la yichra v'la yishtacha, we bow only to God, there is the fundamental idea that what matters most in our lives is Yiddishkeit. What matters most in our lives are our children. What matters most in our lives is Ruchnias. We all know it, we know it, but we're busy. And unfortunately, we're so busy that sometimes it becomes relegated to second and third and fourth place. And it is a lesson to learn to us, from all of these people. It's what the Rebbe always teaches us. Yiddishkeit. That's what a Jew is. We exist because of Yiddishkeit, and we have to keep Yiddishkeit the most important thing in our lives, and will remain the most important thing in the Eibishter's eyes.